Thank you. My husband and I wanted to tell our story while we were going through it. We didn't want to wait for the end to be written. We didn't trust the tidy depiction we might create if we waited until we had time to process. We all rewrite our histories in subtle ways, so we created in the middle. It was for the best. If we had waited for the end to be written, we never would have created anything. If you want to know the full story of the creation of that dragon cancer, then you need to know this. We thought of ourselves like Elijah. This is my son Joel when he was 4 months old, and here he is just 8 months later. The doctors found the tumor in his brain a couple weeks after his first birthday. It explained his subtle head tilt and all the vomiting. On our third night in the hospital, I started a blog. It was just a place to point friends and family who wanted the news and needed to know how to pray but didn't warrant a phone call in the middle of our crisis. On the 5th day in the hospital, Joel's blog had hundreds of visitors. Many of them were people from around the world who we had never met, and suddenly they were praying for our son to be healed. And in the weeks that followed, those hundreds of visitors became thousands of visitors, and a total stranger asked us if she could start a Facebook page to request prayers for Joel. It felt like God was drawing a crowd, and that gave us a lot of confidence as we asked him for miracles. We saw quite a few. They were small miracles, but pretty amazing. And none of that really matters now, except to say that our faith was on the rise and that God was Emmanuel. He was with us. 10 months into a 22-month cancer treatment plan, Joel's tumor returned. The doctors explained to us that Joel would die. They had already given him the most aggressive treatments that they could, so they had nothing new to offer, and they explained to us that palliative treatment, commonly referred to as end-of-life care, would help alleviate some of his symptoms and keep him comfortable so that he could enjoy his last 2 to 4 months of life as much as possible and die in peace and comfort. But thousands of people were following Joel's story, and they had witnessed all of those little miracles. So surely God would prove himself faithful by honoring our faith. Joel's tumor should have grown explosively, but it didn't. There was a time when we drew a sample of his spinal fluid, and it had clumps of cancer cells in it so thick that you didn't need a microscope to see that the sample was cloudy. It spelled disaster for Joel. Our doctors had us sign a do not resuscitate form that day in the office. And then when they tested his spinal fluid sample again a week or two later, they couldn't find a single cancer cell. Now, our doctors cautioned us that what we saw as a miracle might have been a sampling error, but then palliative radiation that was meant to alleviate Joel's symptoms killed his tumor. 6 months later, we had a very happy 6 months in between, a new tumor appeared, and our doctors had told us that this was sure to happen, but then palliative radiation killed that tumor also. Now, Joel's cancer wasn't cured, it was still terminal, but there was no question that his cancer was behaving oddly, and we started to expect Joel to live. And we learned to weather the ups and downs of these recurring tumors that would grow very slowly and die very quickly, much to the amazement of our doctors. And all of this gave us hope that God was preparing to do something remarkable for Joel. And hope is intoxicating. In the middle of suffering, even the slightest bit of joy is completely amplified. So we learned love and faith and grace on a totally different scale than we had ever encountered them before. Our lives didn't look a lot like the lives of our friends and our family, and that was really challenging, but in some ways it was really beautiful because God was so present in the middle of our struggle. And so we found ourselves wanting to share this strange world that we were living in. We felt like we were in the middle of an incredible testimony that God was slowly unfurling in front of thousands of witnesses, and we wanted to tell Joel's story in the middle of that testimony. And so we began developing a video game called That Dragon Cancer. Now, it may not be what you would normally think of as a video game. It was very slow and thoughtful and contemplative. It was full of faith and hope, but it was also raw and transparent. We didn't shy away from showing the desperation that we felt or the doubt that crept in from time to time. God was telling this amazing story, and so it made sense to us to make it as clear as we possibly could just how earthen our vessels really were, because Joel would be healed. And we didn't want anyone to think that it was because we were so perfect or so deserving of a miracle, and so we put our flaws on display inside of a video game designed to honor the God who is faithful despite our failings. We wanted people to hear Joel's story and think to themselves, if God could answer their prayer, he could answer anyone's. And the crowds just kept coming. We took our humble demo of our video game to the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco. And this is a place where everyone shows up and they're hustling and they're networking and they're trying to make a deal or find a producer and find funding for their video games. And we showed our demo, and people started searching for funding for our game. And journalists started to write about our video game, even though all we had was this 6-minute scene. God opened door after door for us, and more people learned about Joel, and it just felt like the miracle was on its way, and there were going to be so many people standing around to witness it. We were like Elijah. And the video game was our altar, and we just kept pouring water on it, confident that God would astound these crowds that he had drawn when he finally sent fire from heaven. Now, our lives were hard. This whole time, Joel's cancer, its symptoms, the effect it all had on his siblings, and then the news that we got almost every year that this time Joel would really die. It all took a terrible toll on our family. But in the middle of that pain, we couldn't deny that God kept moving. And so our sufferings did not feel worthy to be compared to the glory that was coming. We had lofty goals in our game design. We asked ourselves these heady questions like, would it be possible for us to teach the concept of grace through video game mechanics? Now, it turned out that that answer was actually pretty simple because grace is a core mechanic in a lot of game design. If you think about playing Super Mario Brothers, the mushroom is placed in the level by a designer right at the moment where you're most likely to need it. And any time that you're playing a video game with a really hard boss level, the odds are pretty good that a diligent and observant player can discover a secret power-up just in time to defeat the enemy. We realized we didn't need to invent grace mechanics because those mechanics already existed. We just had to point them out, and so we started designing levels that would show all the ways that a thoughtful creator considers his player in the middle of his game design and offers them grace at the precise moment when they need it the most. We asked ourselves if we could create a moment of prayer inside a video game that would have a real spiritual impact outside of the video game. We wondered if we could teach the players the kind of holy rest and surrender that Joel's fight with cancer was teaching us. My husband and I never really liked art that just asked a lot of questions, and so we wanted to make a video game that provided solid answers. We loved talking about the ways that video games are just a wonderful way to explore a worldview. So, as a video game designer, you create a world, and the players will live in the world that you create. You may not be in the world with them, but the players can discover a lot about you as a creator just by considering the kind of world that you've made for them. Will the player have free will? And if so, what exactly does that mean? Are there any forces that will be beyond the control of the player? Is the ending going to be fixed and determined, or can the player's actions change the story? Anytime that we talked about creating and designing a video game about our son's terminal cancer diagnosis, my husband loved to tell people, I made a world, and I put my son in that world, and I'm asking you to love my son and to let that love change you. We just wanted to make a beautiful video game that would let the players feel what we were feeling in the context of our faith. And we thought that God was going to use that video game to show the world this glorious miracle that we had been catching glimpses of for years. And so we gave a lot of interviews. We answered so many questions. People wanted to know why. And as we answered them, we were like Elijah, calling out the prophets of Baal, confident that God would not let us be put to shame. By the time that Joel was 5 years old, his tumors had recurred at least a dozen times. On 3 separate occasions, our doctors had encouraged us to enroll him into hospice care and prepare for his death. But each time, he had recovered. Now, the tumor that doctors found just before his 5th birthday was in a location in his brain that had already received the maximum dose of radiation that they could safely give to that one place in his brain. So they couldn't offer us the same palliative radiation that had always been so effective before on his other tumors, even though they didn't know why. But it was fine. Pour more water on the altar. This felt like the moment. No more half measures, no more breadcrumbs of grace, no more explainable miracles. Joel would be healed. When medicine finally failed, God would reveal a healing power that would astound the world. And so we prepared ourselves for an 11th hour rescue. We watched as Joel declined. He stopped walking. He stopped talking. He stopped swallowing. He stopped breathing without assistance. And this whole time, we made home videos that were hard to watch.
Yeah. What's the matter? Yeah.
We weren't afraid to show just how dark this darkness felt as we watched our son slip away from us, because we were so sure that the light that we were anticipating, that unexplainable fire from heaven, was just a few pages further in this story that we were partnering with God to tell. God had saved Joel's life at least 4 different times already, and so I was just waiting for the grand finale, that big final miracle that would leave Joel totally restored. And that was the miracle that we had designed our video game to show the entire world. And so the documentary cameras rolled, and we prayed. And the world waited, and Joel died. I'm not ashamed to tell you that I spent the next several days praying for my son to be raised from the dead. The stakes felt so high, and my faith had been building exponentially over these 4 years of his illness until my constant prayer became, God, just do whatever is most glorious. So nothing felt impossible. Joel's physical resurrection from the dead here on this earth felt like precisely the kind of grand, massive miracle that we were waiting for. The world watched. I still have dreams that Joel lived, that he was raised from the dead. And I think it's because, in the words of a classic Walt Disney song that you have all heard before, a dream is a wish your heart makes when you're fast asleep. And in dreams, you can lose your heartache because whatever you wish for, you keep. But faith is not a dream, and faith is not a wish. Faith is a mystery between a time-bound human and an eternal, almost unfathomable God. I don't know why God didn't send fire from heaven for my son. Perhaps what God thought was most glorious was a soggy, wet altar. We wanted to tell Joel's story through that dragon cancer in the middle. So as we began designing it, it was the record of a miracle. But when he died and he wasn't raised from the dead, his game became his memorial. It ended up documenting our wrestle with God, our disappointed faith, our heartbreak and our despair, but also our comfort, as meager as that felt at the time. I no longer had any answers for anyone, so the art that we created to share our son's life with the world ended up asking a lot of questions. We included audio recordings of the prayers we prayed the night Joel died in our video game. And I remember as the documentary film crew was there that night filming those exact recordings, I thought to myself, it's so rare that anyone ever captures the apex of someone's faith. Because our prayers that night felt like a precious offering of pure faith mixed with joy and reverence. They were so full of anticipation. But those same prayers in our video game feel desperate and disillusioned, a mocking precursor to devastating disappointments. I wanted to take them out of the video game. I mean, how could I let players hear those prayers when their context would always be all wrong? Most of these players know the end of the video game from the very beginning. So they can't really hear those prayers the way that we prayed them. Of course, God knew the end from the beginning too. And he let us pray those prayers and make this video game and talk to the press. Our video game now showcased what felt like the failure of our faith. So how could we release a game like that and have any hope that it would still honor God? A wise friend of mine once told me, you can only share the testimony that you've been given. But I didn't want to share this testimony. I wanted to share the testimony that I was expecting. What did God stand to gain by showcasing my suffering? We stopped trying to make this grand, theological, grace-filled experience. And I lost hope that our video game could teach anything to anyone. And so I started praying for the video game and for the film. I prayed that God's anointing would rest on them, and I prayed over those disappointed prayers because I imagined all of the memories that they might stir up for players who had experienced their own disappointments, who felt like God had said no to the greatest desires of their heart also. And what could I do for those people? Nothing. I could do nothing. My video game could do nothing. I had nothing to teach, nothing to say, no comfort to offer. And so I prayed that when the story of my suffering touched the nerve of the player's own suffering, that God's Spirit would rest in that moment. I asked him to minister to those newly reawakened hurts, one-on-one, personally with each player, and it felt impossible. But I had prayed impossible prayers before. We released that dragon cancer to the public. It was not the story of a grand miracle. It was the story of our wrestle with God after heartbreaking disappointment. The altar had not caught fire, but I was beginning to see that the miracle that the crowds had stuck around to see might be the grace God gave us to walk out our suffering in public, sharing our hurt and our disappointment. That dragon cancer was featured in the New York Times, the LA Times, the Guardian, USA Today, several other prominent publications. Wired magazine wrote a 10-page article about the game, and Reply All made a podcast about the making of the game that was re-aired on one of our favorite podcasts, Radio Lab. And the documentary film that many of the students here tonight watched about the making of that dragon cancer aired on PBS, and it won an Emmy for its filmmakers. That dragon cancer went on to win the BAFTA, which is a British Academy Award for the most innovative game of the year. It won the Peabody Facebook Futures of Media Award and the first annual Matthew Crump Award for Cultural Innovation from South by Southwest. In my limited view, our faith had failed. The fire didn't come, but the crowds kept pushing in, pressing forward to catch a glimpse of what God was doing. And I couldn't see it. I didn't understand it. People told us that when they played that dragon cancer, it helps them appreciate their families more. They took the time to be really present. They hugged their kids a little tighter. They found more reasons to say yes. And Joel had taught us all those same things in our own lives. Now, it wasn't something that I designed the game to teach. It wasn't a lesson I had planned to offer, but the fruit of Joel's life made its way to people through his video game somehow. And there were people who told us that they weren't Christians because they always had so many questions. They wrestled with doubt, so they didn't think that they could believe in God. And then they played that dragon cancer. I will never forget that they told me, I guess I never realized that Christians have all the same questions that I do. I always thought that all my questions disqualified me from faith somehow. And then I saw it. I had wanted to create a video game that had all the answers. I wanted it to celebrate how we won and Joel survived, but who would that video game minister to ultimately? It might provide some hope for people who were standing in faith. But if they were already standing in faith, they didn't need to have hope in our story. Their hope could stay in Jesus, where it belonged. The triumphant story that I wanted my life to tell, and that I wanted this game to tell, could have shattered someone who had experienced real loss. But my story of grace in the middle of a tragedy ministers to people who are in desperate need of ministry. Because people can relate to disappointment. people understand brokenness. I didn't need to have all the answers. I just needed to be able to say, I've felt that too. And it is really hard. And then, if the peace that passes all understanding is present in that conversation, it will do more to draw someone to God than any bold recounting of a miracle ever could. If my story of suffering makes it so that someone realizes that their anger with God, their lingering disappointment, their failures, their doubts, and all of their questions do not keep them from running to God, then I can carry the suffering that I've been asked to carry, and I can be thankful for it as I do my best to follow Jesus. That dragon cancer is an intimate conversation. It's an invitation to walk with my family through the hardest season of our lives so far. It's not an altar call, but there's an altar in it, soaked in tears, dripping wet. But I have finally begun to understand that the reason that the crowds never left is that our altar that never caught fire was wet with living water. Thank you.